Before we start, I'm just going to say this is my favourite pattern so far, and I'm really hoping that you guys love it as much as I do. Hi everyone, welcome back to Country Cow Designs. In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make my new Konin bowler purse. So as you can see, I've got a few prototypes lined up here because I kind of wanted to show you the little variations I went through as I was designing the pattern. Now if you want to sew along with me and actually make the bag, you can buy the pattern from my website countrycowdesigns.com. If you just want to watch me sew, that's great, and hopefully you'll pick up some tips throughout the tutorial as well. So this is the final prototype for the pattern. Now, as you can see, this one kind of looks a bit more like clean around the edges and sturdy. This one is made using Peltex 71F stabilizer. So basically I tried loads of different stabilizers so that I could show you like the difference in the finished bag. So this one's got this Peltex in. I love this finish. It's nice and firm, it's sturdy. It's exactly what I was going for. This one has Decaville Heavy, so you can again see it's kind of got clean seams, but the seams are like a little bit softer. It's not quite so sturdy, it's not quite as rigid. It's still great. You can use any stabilizer you want, to be honest. It's just going to result in a slightly different bag. This one is entirely vinyl and also has Decaville Heavy. I quite like the finish with this because with the vinyl as well, again, it's come out quite sturdy. Now this one has sew-in foam. So I don't recommend sew-in foam purely because, as you can see, it's kind of made my seams a bit like frumpy. Now I could have trimmed the foam out of the seam, which would have reduced it a little bit. But personally, I think I'd recommend instead using fusible foam, and then that way you can keep it totally out of the seams. So I do love this bag, but yeah, I'm not quite happy with the foam finish. I prefer the Decaville Heavy or the Peltex. Now, these two bags, I also changed this top handle to just 3/4 of an inch because I wanted to use O-rings. Now, I don't recommend using O-rings because you can probably tell they're very close to the zip. So in the pattern, I recommend D-rings, but you can totally use O-rings if you want to, and they look pretty cool. Now again, in the pattern, I'm going to recommend that you use cotton or canvas for your handle because it goes right down into the seam. If you want to use vinyl for this top handle, I definitely recommend trimming 3/4 of an inch off after you've put your measurements in. So I'll give you the instructions for that during the video, and then use strap ends instead. Even if your machine can make it through with the extra layers here, it will just end up with like a big lump and it won't look so pretty. So that's just something to bear in mind. Now, all of these bags were made on my domestic sewing machine. I've got a very good domestic sewing machine. It's a Bernina 930 record. It's an old machine. Vintage machines are just brilliant. I've also got a Singer 201. They are fantastic and really cheap to get hold of. I think I paid £15 for mine. So the older machines are great for making bags. You can do it on a good, new domestic as well. And of course, if you've got an industrial sewing machine, you can just sew it with whatever materials you want. Now a little bit about this bag. So it's got a crossbody strap and we're using webbing for the strap. It's quite a quick bag to make, to be honest. So you can see you can wear it as a crossbody. The grab handle is literally just there to grab it. It's not for the purpose of anything else. And then we've got the base. So because it's like a separate base, you could use cork, vinyl, something like that. That's going to endure a little bit. Now inside we have got a built-in wallet. So we've got a zip pocket for coins. We've got a slip pocket for notes. And then we have 6 card slots. So it's like a full built-in wallet. And we've also got a mesh stretchy slip pocket, which is great for keeping your phone or anything else like that. So this is just a brilliant bag for your everyday needs. You can fit everything that you need for like a standard day, provided that you're not a new mum or something like that. You can fit, your daily essentials in there. You've got the built-in wallet, you can fit your mask and your phone and just different things like that. Lots of room to spare. So this one actually, the fabric is a fabric that I designed too. So I bought the little flowers from an artist and then put together this design, and you can probably tell that the webbing matches too. It's got the same flowers. So this bag is kind of cool because it's my hardware, my zips, my fabric. Yeah, it's really nice. It's like managed to create it from start to finish, which just feels really good. This bag is my everyday bag. So I use this all of the time, have done for quite a few weeks now. I love it. It's a prototype. It was the first, or was it the second? No, it was the second prototype. The first one was truly awful. So this is the second prototype. So I would never sell it to anybody. I tend to keep them for myself and use them and just, you know, like work out any design changes that I need to make and that sort of thing. But I've got to be honest, I'm loving it. And I love the size. That hasn't changed at all. Now, this is called the Konin bowler purse, Konin. And Konin is the Cornish word for rabbit. So a lot of you might know that I'm Cornish. I'm from Cornwall, and I do love to use the language for some of my bag names because it's kind of a dead language, but it's also quite a lovely language, and it's really handy for being able to like search online. So if you make your bag, make sure that you use like the phrase for tagging it, Konin bowler purse, and there'll be nothing else coming up like that. So that's quite handy, although I am now aware that it's also the name of a city in Poland, so hence my hashtag for this one is Konin bowler purse. So hopefully I've covered everything, and throughout this tutorial I'll go into all of the details of how to do things. If you have any questions, you can always drop them in the comments, or you can email me at countrycowdesigns@gmail.com. Now, a lot of the materials that you're going to see me using, a lot of the hardware is from my website. So if you're looking for hardware, I do hardware kits for these bags, zipper tape, just various things. You'll see I've got like some unique zipper pulls and that kind of thing. So they're all available from the website as well. And hopefully that's everything. So we will make a start. Okay, so here are all my pattern pieces cut out. So this is what I'm using for the exterior. This is a cotton canvas, and I've already interfaced all of my pieces. For the base and the handle accent, I'm using cork, just so that it's a little bit more durable. If you're sewing on a domestic machine like me, just bear in mind what materials you're using. I have made one of these out of all vinyl, but my machine, you know, it was tough, but it managed it. But just bear in mind that whatever materials you're using is going to get thick at the end, and you need to make sure your machine can handle it. For my lining fabrics, I've got my mesh stretch pocket. So I get my mesh from By Annie's, which you can get from So Hot in the UK, or you can get it direct from By Annie's in the USA. Now for my lining fabric, I've got this linen look cotton, so it's just cotton. And I've interfaced all of my pieces. Now you'll notice in the pattern that I state about using woven interfacing for the exterior, non-woven for some of the exterior. The non-woven is really, really good for things like the wallet because it gives it a crisper finish, which is going to make the folds for the card slots much better. Also, non-woven is cheaper, so where you can use it, I think it's great to use it because it'll reduce the cost for you. So everything is interfaced there. And the wallet piece, you'll notice the interfacing is smaller and needs to be inset by 1/2 inch. That's because later on this is going to get really bulky, so we haven't interfaced the edges. Now for my stabilizers, I've chosen to use Peltex 71F for this one. This is the finish that I really like, and I've just cut out all of my pieces there. So before we go any further, I'm going to fuse my stabilizer centrally to my pattern pieces. So fusing it to the exterior pattern pieces. Lastly, I've got my webbing for the strap, and then I've got my double fold bias binding for later for binding the bag. You could use 1-inch fold over elastic if you prefer, that would work great too. Then I've just got my hardware, which I've got in matte black. I'm also going to do the additional step of adding bag feet and adding rivets. Those are both optional. Then I've got my number 3 zip for the lining. Now, if you're using zipper tape and you've not done this before, putting a pull onto this tape is nice and easy. You cut the tape to the length you need, then you just pull it open, and you need to find the curved edge of the zip head. And you're just going to put one side in a little way and then bring the other side in to match. Then you simply push that on like that, put it on a flat surface, push your fingers down onto the zip and just pull it on. And it's as easy as that. So I've already put my zips onto my main exterior zip and those are closing toward each other. So I've just added my Peltex and I've fused it to the center of each pattern piece. Now it's important that it's in the center because we don't want it in the seam allowance when we're sewing, or else we really will have trouble getting through those seams later. Now for the base, you've got 2 pieces of stabilizer. That's just to make sure the base is really stable. So this second piece, just make sure that it's centered lengthways and fused on top of the first piece. So now that all my pattern pieces are prepared, I'll set those aside. Now, if you've got anything that you're wondering about the pattern pieces, just refer to the cutting chart in the pattern. The cutting chart details exactly what you need from each pattern piece and what stabilizers and things like that need fusing to it. So for your strap, you're going to need your piece of webbing, your 2 swivel hooks and a slider. Now the first thing we're going to do is just put this webbing through one side of the slider and then back over that center bar. Now we want to hide this raw edge, so we're going to fold it underneath itself. And you're going to want to fold that back by 1 inch or 1.5 inches, something like that. Doesn't need to be, you know, particularly specific. And then just clip that in place. Now there's quite a bulk to get through here, depending on the type of webbing you're using. So I'm going to use a large needle. I'm going to use a size 90 needle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew across here, up, across and back down. And then I'm going to sew an X by going across here, back across there and back down. So that should really hold it in place. And you'll notice that I use a hump jumper as I get to this bar here, because that will allow me to get as close as I can to it with my needle. If you don't have any webbing handy and you want to make a standard 1-inch crossbody strap, I've got a video on how to make a double-sided no raw edges crossbody strap, so I'll link that here so that you can use that as a guide for making a crossbody strap. So when I'm sewing these, it rarely comes out perfect, so that's why I tend to use a matching thread, just because it will look a lot neater. So if you grab the other end of your webbing, you need to put a swivel hook on the end, and then you want to come back to your slider and put this end back through the slider, so it's going up and over the middle bar. Okay, so this is what you've got on one end. And on the other end, we're going to put the swivel hook on and fold this back over again. Now you just want to check that your swivel hooks are both on correctly. And what you want here is to make sure that this fold is going to be on the same side as this section ideally. So that means that you've got sort of a neat side and one side that has the folds on it. Okay, so I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine. I'm going to do the same thing as before and sew a box here and then an X. So that should be your webbing strap finished. So set that aside for later, and you need to grab your handle. So this is my exterior handle piece. And what I've done is drawn a line down the center on the wrong side of the fabric. Now I'm going to fold these two long edges in. Now we're leaving the short edges raw, and you just want to fold that into the center line and press it. Now fold the other long edge in, and I'm just going to press that one too. And I'm just leaving like the tiniest little gap between the two, because that gives me like a slightly neater edge. Now you're going to fold it along the original center line and press that one last time. And I'll use some clips to just hold this together before we sew it. Now what I'm going to do is top stitch this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure you pay attention to the seam allowances here, because we want to sew it on later with an 1/8, and we don't want to be sewing over our existing sewing. So right now we're just doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance from each long edge. So that's your handle prepped, so just set that aside, and the last thing we're going to do in this preparation section is the grab handle like accent. This is an optional step. If you don't want to have this, that's absolutely fine. But what we're going to do is we're going to put it wrong sides together and clip these long edges together. Now on the underneath of the handle, the seams will be raw, which is why you need to be using something like cork or vinyl. Cotton or canvas will not work for this step, because we're going to have some raw edges on show. So I'm going to sew this edge here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once your handle accent is sewn together, we're going to move on to step 2, and you're going to need your exterior zip, your handle, and then you're going to need your exterior and lining wide gussets and your exterior and lining narrow gussets. So we'll start with the handle, and you'll see that I've already marked mine. In the pattern there are measurements for marking it from both short edges, 4 marks from each edge. Now if you're using entirely vinyl or cork for your handle and you don't want it to go into the seams because it will be very bulky, then I would now trim 3/4 inch off each short end after you've marked these measurements. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sew a small square, 1/8 inch from this edge, and then 1/8 inch from this line, up here and here. So it's going to be 1/8 inch in from all edges. And we'll do exactly the same thing on the other end. So you're going to notice there's a bit of fussy stitching on this handle, which is why I recommend using a matching thread like I am. That way, you know, if you've got slightly imperfect stitching or anything like that, you're not going to need to worry about it. So the next thing you need to do is put your handle accent on, presuming that you're having one. So you just want to slide it onto the end of your handle. And your 2 most central marks should be about there. And this is going to sit between those 2 marks. Now we want this seam to be on the underneath, so it's going to be hidden. And you don't want the seam in the center because then when we fit rivets, it will break the seam. So you want it off center a little bit. Okay, like this. And what we're going to do is fold this seam in, and the seam is going to get stitched down. So once you're happy with its placement, you can put a couple of clips on. Okay, so you can see now that when we punch through with the rivets, it's not going to go through and break the seam. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the next mark along here, and we're going to stitch with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance along here, up the long edges, across and back down. You might need to use a hump jumper to get over the seam just here. Once we've sewn that, we're also going to sew with 1/4 of an inch from the long edges and 1/8 of an inch. So we're going to create like a box here. So 1/8 of an inch from these short edges, 1/4 of an inch from these long edges. What that will do is that will sew this down and keep it really neat underneath the handle. Okay, so that's your handle accent stitched down, and hopefully that should then stay in place. We're also going to set some rivets, just 2. These are optional, but I really like to add rivets to my handle. I just think it's a really nice detail. So I'm going to fit mine about 3/8 of an inch from the edge. So I'm going to go about there. Now, I know some of you are wondering about my little rivet template, and this is something that I was given by Calosphere. I'll link it in the video description for anybody that's wondering. It's just really handy for making sure your rivets are even. So I've got a hole punch, and I will punch a hole through the handle ready for the rivets. And I'm using these double cap rivets. So I'm going to put the post through the top, and then on the underneath, I'll just push the cap straight on there. And this will again help just to hold this seam down. Now I've got my press for setting the rivets now. You can see it's mounted on an old chopping board. Now what I'm going to do, I always cover the bottom die, which is a metal die. I always cover it with fabric because I can find that metal dies will damage your rivets. So I'm going to put this in. I'm going to make sure this bottom one is sat nice and snug inside the bottom die. Then I bring the top down and I just check that that's all centered, because if it's not centered, you're going to end up with a dented rivet. And then press. Now, if you're making a lot of bags and you're wondering about rivet press, I definitely recommend them. They are expensive and you need a different set of dies for different size rivets and different tools, but it's just brilliant and it just saves a lot of time. Now, once your handle is ready, we can move on to assembling the gusset. So on the wrong side of the fabric, of all my gusset pieces, I've marked the centers, and I've also marked the centers on my zip. Now what I'm going to do is grab the exterior wide gusset piece, and I'm going to match up the center marks on my zip to the center marks on this wide gusset. And then I'm just going to clip it along the entire length. Now that's clipped into place, I'm going to sew along here. I'm just going to baste it into place with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now grab your lining wide gusset, and we're going to put this right sides together with the exterior so that the zip is sandwiched in between. And match up those centre marks again, and then clip it along the entire length. Now we're going to sew through here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you're back stitching, and when you reach your zip, your pulls, you're going to want to leave your needle in, lift up your presser foot, and then move the zips underneath the presser foot. When I'm sewing zips, I prefer to leave my standard presser foot on, and then I move my needle as far as it will go to the left so that I can use my presser foot as a guide up against the zip. It means that I get a nice straight finish to my zips. But if you prefer, you could swap out for a zipper foot and then sew this on. Okay, so now we're going to push both sides of the fabric away from the zip. Now you may prefer to get your iron out here and actually press this with an iron to get a nice neat finish. Now because of your Peltex or whatever stabilizer you're using, you should be able to feel that it's quite firm here. What I'm going to do is just clip the lining and exterior together so that they match. Once you've got a neat finish here, we're going to top stitch with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance through here. Now you need to attach the narrow side of the gusset. So I'm just going to move my zips into the centre so they're slightly out of the way. And we want to match up those centre marks again. But I'm also looking to check that it matches on the ends because sometimes my centre marks are not perfect. And just clip that into place. Now I'm going to baste that into place with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So if you're using nylon zip tape like me, you'll notice that it starts to fray a bit. So what you can do is get a lighter. This is like an electric lighter, but it does the same sort of thing. And you just want to very lightly melt the ends of your zip, and that will stop it from fraying in the future. There we go. Now flip this over. And we need to place the lining piece right side down on the back of the zip. So again, we want it to like match up with everything else. So you can either use your center marks or just make sure that it's matching on the ends. Now we're going to sew through this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to press both fabrics away from the zip and top stitch it exactly the same as we did with the other side. So we're now ready to fit the handle. Now, if you're worried about your zips coming off because you're moving them, you can always just put a clip on the end. I don't really worry about mine because it never seems to happen to me. But if you are concerned about that, a clip will stop that from happening. So what we want to do now is fit the handle. So first of all, we're going to mark the centers of these short edges on the gusset. So I find this easiest to do just on my mat. And then you want to mark the center of your handle as well. Now, you need to fit the D-rings to your handle, and you do not want to forget these because otherwise you're not going to be able to attach your crossbody. So I would recommend just putting them on now. And I'm just going to put a clip here so they don't fall down. Now what we want to do is match up these center marks here and attach the strap. Now we need to make sure that we're only attaching it to the exterior, not the lining. So what I'm going to do first of all is clip the lining out of the way. So you can just fold it back like that and clip it on each edge. That means that when we're sewing the handle, we're only sewing through this exterior piece. So we're going to match these up. Now, what you might want to do is attach some double-sided tape. And if you want to use double-sided tape here to hold it in place, I recommend only fitting the tape between the end and this first mark that you made, and then between the second mark and the top of the handle accent. Okay, so I've stuck some double-sided tape on mine. It's not particularly accurate, but basically where the lines are, that's where your D-ring is going to be, and you don't want any double-sided tape there. Okay, so I'm going to stick that end down, matching up my center marks and clipping that into place. And you can see that it's nice and close to the edge that we top stitched. I'm going to do the same thing on this other end. Okay, so last chance to check that you've got your D-rings on already. Don't forget those. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew this with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance up here, across that first line and back down. And you're going to do the exact same thing on this side. 1/8 of an inch seam allowance up the long edge, across to your first mark and back down. So that is the ends of my handle sewn down. Now, if you're having an all vinyl or all cork strap and you're keeping it out of the seams, then I would fit the strap ends now, and I would fit the handles 3/4 of an inch in from each end. Sewing up to the strap ends can be a little bit tricky, but if you used a hump jumper, you could get nice and close, and you could use a rivet afterwards as well, just to make sure that it's staying down. Now we're going to move our D-rings into place. So what we want is for them to be up as close as they can get to where you've just sewn. Okay. And then what we're going to do is push this down, making sure it's nice and straight. It's got a nice straight edge. And we're going to sew this second line, and then with an 1/8 of an inch up here, and then an 1/8 of an inch from where you sewed here. So you're just doing one big box, and you just make sure that you're an 1/8 of an inch from each edge. So where you sewed here, where you've sewn here, and from these edges. So we're going to do that on that side, and then you're going to do the same on this side. And what should then happen is your handle will naturally pop up. So if you've got a bit of double-sided tape, you can use that now just to make sure that it stays put. Okay, so that's everything sewn down. You've got a little gap there where your D-rings are. Now the last thing to do is to fit some rivets if you want them. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to fit mine about 1/4 of an inch away from each bit of stitching. So I've got my 2 lines of stitching here, this one that's come down here and this one's come up here. And I'm going to fit it just below there. Once your rivets are fitted, you can unclip the lining of the wide gusset. And that is your completed top gusset. So now we'll move on to step 3. For this section, you're going to need your completed top gusset, and you're also going to need your exterior base and your lining base. And if you're having them, your bag feet. Now the first thing to do is to check that your top gusset is the same size as your exterior base. Now the reason it can be different is just because, you know, you've used a different seam allowance, or maybe you've used a different size zip if you've used a number 3 zip or something like that. So it doesn't matter really what size this comes out. What matters is that you can match it to your base. So I'm just going to compare the two and see if either of them need trimming. Okay, so you can see that my top gusset is just the tiniest bit bigger. So I'm just going to trim that off. I think it's just under 1/8 of an inch. If you've got quite a bit extra, I would recommend trimming it evenly from this side and this side. But because it's such a tiny amount, I'm just going to trim it off here. Now that those are matching, I am just going to trim a tiny bit off my lining base. So what I'm going to do is trim 1/8 of an inch off one of the short ends. That's just because the lining is going to be on the inside and I want it to be a tiny bit tighter. So I'm just removing that tiny little portion there. Next, I'm going to add my bag feet. So this is optional, but I've decided on this one that I'm going to fit them. So you've got measurements in the pattern if you want to fit bag feet yourself. So what I'm going to do first of all is mark where I want those to go. Now next, it really depends what type of bag feet you're using. I've got these little bag feet that have screws. So what I'm going to do is punch a hole. I'm going to use my smallest hole on my rivet punch. And then what I can do is fit my bag through the hole. And I'm going to repeat that process so that I've got all 4 bag feet fitted. Now that my bag feet are fitted, I'm going to grab this top panel, and what I want to do is just baste it together on all 4 edges. So I'm just going to make sure that these edges of the lining and exterior match up neatly and clip them together. Now I'm going to baste around here with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now we're ready to start attaching the base. So we're going to put the base right sides together. This is the exterior base with one end of the top gusset. So put those right sides together and clip them. And I find this easier to sew if I've just got a couple of clips on the edges. So I'm just going to baste this on to start with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to flip that over. And I want to put the lining right sides together. So this is the lining base, right sides together with the lining on the top gusset. And again, clip those together. Now I'm going to sew through here with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, if you have got a lot of layers going on here, you're going to notice that when you get to the strap section, it is quite thick. So you might want to change out your needle for a larger one. I am going to change mine out for a size 100 now. So now we need to push both of these away. So we're pushing them away from the top gusset. Just want to get like a nice neat crease there. And you want to do the same on the exterior. Give it a press with your fingers or an iron, depending what materials you're using. And then I'm going to put a couple of clips here to hold the 2 base pieces together. So that's the exterior and the lining. I want to make sure they're both nice and straight. And I'm going to top stitch through here with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to hand crank some of this because I want to make sure that as I go through these extra bulky seams that I'm not going to break my needle or anything. And this is where, if you're having an all cork or all vinyl strap, you will notice that it gets very bulky here, which is why I recommend that you cut it short and use strap ends instead. So So that is the section that my machine doesn't love. So I have to increase my top tension to make sure that it comes through neat on the other side, because otherwise I will get big loopy stitching. So just consider increasing your top tension if that happens to you. And I hand crank, so I just turn the hand wheel as I go over this section here because it is so bulky and I'm just using a domestic machine. So now what I'm going to do is attach the exterior base to the other end of my top gusset. So again, it's going to be right sides together, and I'm going to baste that with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Right, now you want to flip that over, and we're going to put the other side of the lining base right sides together with the lining on the top gusset. And I'm going to sew through here with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So we're going to turn this out so that we can top stitch that seam. So I'm just going to make it so that the base, exterior and lining are together. And now I'm going to keep it like this so that it's sort of inside out. The lining is on top, because that will make it easier to top stitch. Because what I'm going to do, I'm going to press both the exterior and the lining away here, and I'm going to top stitch through here with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And this is easier to do on my machine with it like this. So you can tell that's a little bit awkward to do, but that's why I just sort of hand crank my way through the whole thing, because it just seems simpler. Now at this point, you're going to feel like your exterior base is longer than your lining. And it is, and it's supposed to be, because as we turn this right side out, the lining needs to sit between the Peltex and the exterior, so it actually does need to be a little bit shorter. And this should give us a nice neat fit. Now what we need to do is we need to baste these long edges together. So I'm first of all just going to push them together and clip them along both long edges. Now I'm going to take that to the machine and baste with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that's your completed gusset. You might have noticed that for the second side, I decided to sew it with the exterior face up. That's because my bag feet were getting in the way whilst I was trying to sew and making it quite awkward to get it through the machine. So you can set that aside, and now we're going to move on to the lining. Step 4 is the wallet. You're going to have your wallet piece, your 2 zip pocket pieces, and your 2 wallet sides. Now set these aside, and we're just going to work on the wallet to start with. So there's measurements in the pattern for marking out these lines. The 2 1/4 inch is the bottom line. So this is the bottom, this is where you need to start. So if you want to, you can just kind of mark it so you don't forget where the bottom is. And what we're going to do is on this first line, we're going to fold the fabric wrong sides together. So you just want to make sure that you're folding it on the line. And that it's straight on this edge. Now you want to give that a press with the iron first. And next we want to fold on the second line, and we want to go the opposite way, so we're going right sides together on that line. And then we're going wrong sides together on the third line. And we're just going to keep doing the same thing, going wrong sides and then right sides and then wrong sides and right sides. And this is how we're going to create the card slots and the slip pocket. Make sure as you're going that this is staying lined up on the edges, nice and neat. And then this second to last line is for the slip pocket, which is why it's actually going to come down further than that last one. And that last line you're not going to fold. Okay, so now that your card slots, you can see you've got these 3 card slots, and then this last one here is the slip pocket, so it's bigger than the others. Now on the top we've still got this line here, and what we're going to do is we're going to cut across that line, and this is going to be the top section for our zip pocket. Now the reason I've done this all as one piece is so that if you've got like a directional print or a pattern print, then when the zip goes in between, your print will carry on exactly as it was. So you should have about 1/2 inch here above this last fold. Now what we're going to do is top stitch these 4 folds. So you just pull them away, top stitch one at a time on all 4 of them. Once you've got all 4 of those top stitched, what you need to do is mark a line up the center, stopping at this top fold. So you just need to find your center first of all. Now this final one is actually a slip pocket, so we don't want to stitch through that. So you want to pull that up and away, and then I'm going to clip the sides together. Now my sides are clipped, I'm going to stitch up this line, stopping just before this final fold, then 1 stitch across and back down. So there it is stitched, and I changed my stitch length for coming across at the top. So I changed it to about a 1mm so that my stitches are really, really close together. So I'm just going to unclip that, and I'm going to tuck the slip pocket back in and then clip the sides. And what we're going to do is baste the sides now to just hold all of this in place. Now I recommend sewing in the same direction on both sides. So it's going to feel a little bit unnatural because you're used to sewing with your fabric on one side. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew from the bottom up and then from the bottom up again on this side. Otherwise you get kind of like a little bit of stretch in each direction, and you can end up with a bit of a wonky pocket. So you're now going to need your zip pocket pieces. And what we're going to do first of all is we're going to put the number 3 zip right side down on this edge. So this is the slip pocket edge. I'm going to put that right side down. Now if you want to, you could mark your centers and just make sure that you've got this nice and neat. Okay, and then we're going to put one of your zip pocket pieces right side down as well. So you're going to end up with these 2 pieces right sides together and the zip in between. Now if you want to, you could baste the zip on first. On this occasion I'm just going to sew them both on at the same time. Now we're going to sew through here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we want to push this away. So we're pushing the zip pocket piece away from the zip. Give it a press with your fingers. Now, because you've used non-woven interfacing, it's a bit crisper. It should all just press away nice and easily, and you probably find that you don't even need to use an iron. Once you've got a neat edge, you just want to top stitch through here with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So you'll notice my zip is closing to the left, which is evidently the way that zips are supposed to close. So if you're wanting to follow that rule, then make sure that you have your zip going to the left. Now you're going to want to grab the top piece that you cut off. So it's kind of similar to your zip pocket, so make sure you've got the right piece. Now this is the bit that was originally connected to the rest of it. And what we're going to do is we're going to put that right sides together with the zip. And just clip that in place. So I'm just making sure that it lines up with the rest of my pocket. And then you can flip that over, and we want to put the remaining zip pocket piece right sides together with the other zip pocket piece. So again, you could baste the top piece first if you want to, but I'm just going to sew them both at the same time. And I'm going to sew that again with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that's sewn, I'm going to push this top piece up. On the back, I'm going to leave the pocket piece facing down. That's fine as it is. I'm just pushing this up, and then I'm going to top stitch through here with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now you need to flip this over, and we just need to seal up the bottom of this pocket. So you want to grab your 2 pocket pieces and clip them together. And you'll notice that one of them is slightly shorter than the other. That is absolutely fine. So I'll just trim down that slightly bigger one, purely because I don't want it getting caught in my seams later or anything. It should be fine. It's a nice distance away anyway, but just to be sure. Now I'm going to sew this closed with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you pull it away from the rest, so you're only sewing through the pocket. Once you've sewn that closed on the bottom, you just want to clip it to the rest of the panel. So we want to clip it all together, and then we're going to baste it to hold it all in place. And we're going to baste each of the sides. And I'm going to do the same thing as before and just sew them both from the same direction, just to be sure that nothing ends up slightly skew. Okay, so everything's held in place now. You're probably getting some fraying on your fabric. That's because we didn't interface the edges. Don't worry about it. It's not going to be a problem because we're going to sew it all up in a minute. So I'm going to grab my 2 wallet sides. Now you can see that these are a different size. What you need to do is match them up with the bottom edge. Ignore the top because we're going to deal with that later. So we're going to put them right sides together like that, matching up that bottom edge, and then clip them into place. We're going to sew these on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So watch out because this is a different seam allowance to most of the pattern. 1/4 of an inch down each side. Make sure that you're using a decent sized needle because there's a lot of layers going on in here. And that's why we didn't have the interfacing in the edges, because it's getting really chunky at this point. I often get a little bit of stretch when I'm sewing these, so that's why again I sewed from the bottom to the top on both sides, so they would both come out the same if there was any stretching. Now what I'm going to do is push these away from the seam. So again, you could use an iron if you want to. And now I'm going to top stitch this in place with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on both sides. Once those are top stitched down, you need to get your other lining panel and you're going to place it over the top, and you'll notice that it's slightly smaller. So what we're just going to do is mark all the way around to make sure that it matches, and make sure that you're paying attention to the sides as well. And then we're going to trim it so that it's the exact same size as this lining panel. If your zip is looking like it's going to get in the seam allowance, then you can just trim that down a little bit. I know I don't tend to trim my zips because I feel like it makes them stronger to leave them as they are, but you don't want to get this caught in your binding, so just trimming off a little bit won't be a problem. We're moving on to the slip pocket section now. So this is a really quick section. If you don't have this mesh stretchy fabric, you can make your slip pocket using 2 lining pieces. So you can use the same pattern piece to cut out 2 lining pieces. You can sew them along the top, wrong sides together, so it's like right sides out, and then you can cover the raw seam at the top with your binding. So that's just a really quick way to do it with the same fabric. Now your mesh should be stretching this way because it's 2-way stretch. And what we're going to do first is fit the binding to the top of the mesh. So I'm just going to put mine into the binding. I'm going to make sure that it's looking pretty central. And what you can do is you can use like a bit of fabric glue to hold this in place, but I'm just going to use some clips. Now it's a little bit awkward, but basically you're just trying to clip it over that top edge, and you want to make sure that you're not stretching the fabric too much. So I've made sure that my binding is equal on both sides, so the back isn't sort of showing here. What I'm going to do now is sew 1/8 of an inch seam allowance along the bottom of the binding and also along the top of the binding. So once that is sewn on, if you have like a little bit of binding hanging over the edge, you can just trim that if you want to. So now we're going to place that on top of our lining panel. Now I've got different colour stitching on different sides because I left my purple bobbin in. So I'm going to put it so that the black is showing up. And I'm just going to clip that into place. Now what you want to do is make sure that these edges are level. So what I'll do is I'll line up the base of my lining piece with this mark on my board, and then I'm going to make sure they're both on this line here. So that's perfect, they're nice and even. Then I can clip the rest into place. If this is kind of wonky, like if it's coming down here, you know, that's a bit drastic, but it will kind of look a bit odd inside your bag. So this fabric will just stretch a little bit as you're fitting it. You don't really want to stretch it, but it does a little bit as you're doing it. So just don't worry too much about it. It's very forgiving. What we're going to do is we're going to baste it on. Because it stretches, I'm going to start in the middle and sew it around this way. And then I'm going to start there again and work that way. If I sew all in one direction, I'm going to end up with some stretch, and this end is going to end up higher, which will look very odd. So that's why I'm going to do it that way. Okay, so you'll notice that mine did stretch. You can see that my stretching fabric is coming off the edge here. This is just not a problem, don't worry about it. You can just trim it down so that it matches the rest of the lining panel. And that will happen a little bit as you're sewing. It's just, you know, working with stretchy fabric like this. You could possibly change to a walking foot so it doesn't stretch so much, but it's not going to cause a problem. Now we're going to move on to the final step. So you're going to need everything that's remaining of your bag. So you're going to need your gusset. You should have 2 pieces of long binding. You should have your slip pocket panel, your wallet lining panel, and your 2 exterior panels. Now what we want to do is put the back exterior together with the slip pocket lining. Now I really recommend that you do it this way, because if you have the wallet in the back of the bag, then when you open up the zip, it's kind of really hard to get to. So I do recommend having the wallet on the front panel. So we'll start with the back panel, and we're just going to match these together so their right sides are facing out, and clip them both together. Once your back panel is clipped together, you just want to kind of make sure that it's matching as best you can. You know, if your cutting isn't absolutely perfect like mine, it's not going to be completely right. But before we baste that, we'll put the front panels together as well. Now, you generally find that your wallet panel isn't going to be absolutely perfect because we've cut it down. So what I like to do is mark the top and bottom centers on both of these panels. Then I can match these centers and clip them together first of all. Okay, now I'm going to clip the rest together, and you'll probably find that you'll need to trim your wallet down a little bit more. I usually do. So you can see that my wallet is too big. I mean, it's a mess, to be honest. So what I like to do is I like to baste it from this side, from the exterior side. So I'm going to baste it with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm also going to baste that back panel. Once this is basted, it will be easier to trim down. So now that those are both basted, I just want to trim this down a little bit more. Now, because of the wallet being on the other side and it's quite bulky, it will sort of tend to pull it in a bit. So I'm just going to check it against this one. And I can see that I just need to trim a little bit from the sides. So I'm not going to trim too much, but I am going to try and get this to match more closely to the exterior panel. But you can see I've not actually trimmed it all because it does look much closer now to this panel. And I basically just want them both to be the same. So you can see that my exterior was pulled in slightly because of the wallet, which has left a little bit here. But that's why we've got 3/8 of an inch seam allowances, because it allows for little things like that. Okay, so a really important step now, if you haven't done it already, is to mark your centers. Now my centers have disappeared because they were on the inside. So I'm just going to mark the top and bottom centers on both of these panels. I'm also going to mark the centers on my top and my base of the gusset. So what I'm going to do is bring these sides together to match. And then that will just help me find the center there. And I'm just marking that white part, which is the interfacing and the stabilizer. Once all your centers are marked, we are going to start fitting the panels. So I'm going to start with the front panel. I'm going to place that exterior side up, and then I want to attach this side of the gusset, so the side that's got the zip on it, to this front panel. Now to do that, I've got to turn this inside out. And then I've got to find that centre mark that I've made and match it up with the centre mark on this panel. So just put a few clips in there just to make sure it's going to stay put. Then you want to match the bottom centre marks as well. Once that's in, I'm going to snip into these bottom curves here. So where the gusset joins, when we're sewing this gusset on, we're actually sewing a 3/8 of an inch inside of this panel, which means that the circumference that we're sewing on is smaller than the circumference of the outside of the panel. So to get the gusset to fit correctly and not pucker, it's got to be a tight fit, particularly on the corners. So on the corners, what we do is we just snip into the gusset. Now you're just snipping in by about 1/4 of an inch, no more than that. Just lots of little snips. So we want to fit those bottom corners last. I'm going to clip these top curves first. And normally I find that I don't need to snip these top curves because they're such like gradual curves. But if your gusset is a really tight fit, you can go ahead and snip these curves in as well if you feel more comfortable doing that. So once you've clipped everything except those bottom corners, you should be able to just check that you've got an equal amount on each corner. So you can see mine are pretty even. That's going to be fine. If they're not, it's because your centre marks aren't correct. They're either not lined up correctly or they're not marked correctly, and then you'll have like a tight gusset on one side and not on the other, in which case you need to go back and check your marks. But I'm happy with mine, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ease this gusset in. So I'm stretching it where I've snipped into it. And where you've snipped, it'll spread out and allow you to fit around that curve. But without those snips, it will not fit. Now once it's clipped into place, you can just take that over to the sewing machine and sew it down. But personally, I find that with this sort of curves, everything just slips a little bit as you're sewing. So I much prefer to hand baste it in place. Now I know this sounds like it's going to be long and complicated, but it's really not. It doesn't need to be accurate. You're just holding it in place. Another option is to staple. A lot of people like to staple their curves into place, but personally I do not like to staple. I find it very difficult stapling, and then I also find that I'm trying to dodge the staples as I'm like sewing, which is just, I don't know, just a bit more stressful than it needs to be. And then you have to remove them afterwards, which is a bit time consuming. So personally, although I'm not normally a hand sewer at all, I would never do anything that requires hand sewing, this is the one time that I think it works in my favour. And yep, it takes me maybe 5 minutes to do this, but it saves me so much time when I get to the machine. Nothing moves. It just stays exactly where I want it. I'm not fighting clips, so I can sew it so much quicker, and I can get it right first time. I don't ever have to, you know, unpick it and start again because it's gone messy. So if you've not tried it before, I definitely recommend trying hand basting. You can see my stitches, they're not neat. I'm just making sure that I'm within the seam allowance. So now that I've basted that on, I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew it on with just short of a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, because later I'm going to sew the binding on with the 3/8 and I don't want to go over the same stitches. So I'm going to have this lining side up because I find that that's the easiest way to get a neat finish on these corners. And as I go, I'm going to be using my awl to guide the bag and make sure that I can get as close to the presser foot as possible. So I had to stop halfway there because I suddenly realized that I only had my size 70 needle in, which was why my machine was struggling so much when it got down to here. So I swapped that out for a size 100 and then it carried on just fine. Now that step can be a little bit difficult because of all the stabilizer. Because the stabilizer is 1/2 inch in, it's kind of like in your way. It almost feels like it would be easier with a zipper foot. But because we're going to sew the binding on in a minute, we're going to sew around the whole lot again. So I wouldn't worry too much about this one if it's not absolutely perfect. And if you are worried and you are using like cotton or canvas like me, then you could just sew it all the way around again. There shouldn't be anything wrong with that. I wouldn't generally recommend it with cork or vinyl because too many holes can be bad for it. But yeah, with canvas, you can just go ahead and do another round. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to attach my binding. Now there's lots of ways to do binding. A lot of people sew it on one side all the way around, then they pull it over and sew the other side. Personally, I struggle to get a nice finish doing that. So I simply do this. I just wrap it around and I start on the bottom on this bag. Now I make sure that my clips are pointing all the same way, the way that I want to sew it. So I want to sew it lining side up again. So I'm going to make all of my clips sit this way up. That way the rounded part of the clip is on top, the flat part is on the bed of my machine. So because I'm going to sew it that way up, I'm going to clip the binding on whilst looking at this side, because this way I can check that all my stitches are neatly covered, and then when I'm sewing it on the other side I'll be able to see that side, so it won't be a problem. So you just want to wrap it all the way around the bag, see. And if you're using my method for binding, just make sure it's nice and taut, that it's tight here, that it's not, you know, baggy. So once you reach the end, you want to fold this over just slightly, and then you're going to lay it on top of the binding where you started. And that ensures that you've got no raw edges. So as I've been doing it, I've checked that that's nice and neat. There's no stitches showing on that side. And then I'm going to be sewing it on this side, so I'll be able to see if any of my stitches are showing. So I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew it on with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to make sure they've got a matching thread. This is one step where I really recommend that you have a matching thread. It makes such a difference to your binding. It looks so much neater if you can't see the stitching. And if afterwards, you know, you failed to catch the binding anywhere, if you've missed any of it, you can just do an extra row of stitching and you won't be able to see it. Whereas if you're using, for example, like white or yellow thread on black binding, it's going to be really obvious. So I do recommend, you know, taking the time to change your thread for this step. So once that's sewn on, you just want to check to see if there's any areas where you haven't caught the binding. And if there is, you can just run a few extra stitches through there and get that into place. So then I like to sort of pop my bag out and just check that everything is looking nice and neat. Okay, so you just want to check that there's not any areas where you've like missed a seam, you know, that you've not caught something in the seam. If you're happy with that, then you're ready to fit the next panel, and then we're almost done. So we're going to do this exactly the same as the first panel, but I am going to open my zip because I feel like it's going to give me a bit more maneuverability. So you should have the center marks marked on there. We're going to match those up and clip them into place first. And then I'll clip the rest of the panel into place, and I'm going to snip into these corners so that I can spread the gusset around these bottom corners. And again, if your gusset feels too tight, you can snip into the gusset around these corners as well and spread that, and that will help it to ease in. So that is all clipped into place, and I've eased those bottom corners in by making snips. And again, you can always snip it at the top if you really need to ease it in a bit more. Now this side is going to be harder to sew because it's kind of quite big now, it's quite chunky, and getting this under your machine is going to be a little bit tougher. So this is definitely where I find my hand basting is helpful, because it's just going to hold it all in place. So I'm going to hand baste this first, and then I'm going to take it over to the machine. I'm going to sew it with just short of a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew it with this side up again so that I can get a nice finish on these curves. So this step is definitely the hardest step of this bag. So don't be afraid to kind of manhandle your bag and crush it a little bit to get it through the machine. But also you're going to want to leave your needle in every time you're adjusting it, because that way you can make sure that you carry on sewing from where you've just stopped. So take your time, leave your needle in, and if you've hand basted this, it's going to be a lot easier because you're going to be able to like move the bag around without clips flying off on you or anything like that. That is definitely the hardest part. So you can see, you know, it wasn't easy, which is why I'm so glad that I hand basted it in place. But I made it round. You just need to take your time, and it's easier if you've got the zip open, because then you can kind of like maneuver things, and don't be afraid to kind of crush your bag into the right position. You can press it afterwards, you know, to get the creases out. So what we're going to do now is going to fit the binding. So we're doing exactly the same as we did on the other side, and I'm just clipping it over both sides. So again, I want to sew looking at this side, so I'm going to clip it into place looking at this side, and that way I can make sure that my binding is covering my stitches and I've got a nice neat finish on this side. Now you also want to make sure that your binding is nice and sort of tight, because if it's a little bit loose, it can kind of bulk up as you're sewing. So because you always get like a tiny bit of stretch with these things, so just watch out for that, because then what you'll have is like the stretch will build up and you'll end up with like a bulky bit on the corner. So when I reached the end, I folded it over so we've got no raw edges again, and now I'm going to sew this on with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now take your time, this is the last bit of sewing. Once you've done this, you are done. Now another thing I meant to say is if you want to use fold over elastic instead of bias binding, you can definitely do that. It's a really nice option. I've used it before, and so long as you've got 1 inch fold over elastic, it's got like a natural fold that goes over the edge, and it's really forgiving, really easy to use. So yeah, that is definitely another option. If you don't really enjoy binding and you're looking for something that might make it a little bit simpler, give that a try. Okay, so that's the really, really tough part. But on the plus side, you don't have to top stitch. So binding, yeah, it can be tough, especially on like a structured bag like this. But it's no tougher than top stitching. So, you know, there's two different evils that you can choose from. So I'm going to turn this right sides out. Ooh, it's going to be a little bit tough to do because of all the stabilizer. Okay, so you want to like check that your corners are nice and neat. Your curves. Pop it out all the way around. Gonna have a few little stitches maybe to get rid of, and you might just have to like push your curves out to get them nice and neat. Give them a bit of a sort of press between your fingers. You're just gonna have to like manhandle it a little bit to get everything to come out really neat. Wow, that is looking good. So I'm making this bag for a friend and she picked the fabrics and everything and she's got good taste. Okay, so if you want to give it a press with an iron, what you can do is fill it with like a small towel and then press it with the iron and then that will help it to hold its shape. Now you're also going to want to attach your crossbody strap. And then you are done. So doesn't that look good? I'm really, really happy with how this one turned out. Yeah, I'm making it for a friend who gifted me some fabric and she chose all the fabrics for this one and she's got good taste, you know. It looks really good. I quite like it with the bag feet as well. I didn't do that on most of mine, so, you know, it is an optional step, but it's nice. Now I know, especially if you've not done binding before, binding can be hard work. Especially with a structured bag like this, but it's so worth it. Just stick with it because it gives like this body and like this structure to the seams. It's kind of like a skeleton inside the bag holding it up, and you just don't get that effect when you like turn it out. So if you sew it a different way and you turn it out instead of having binding, I've made the same bag with binding and without in the past, and you can see the difference in the seams. So it's totally worth the effort. So I'll just show you this one on for size. So you can see it is a good little size, you know, for your daily essentials. Yeah, it's really nice. I'm hoping that you guys enjoyed this tutorial and that you love this new pattern. My next pattern, I do have like just short of 10 patterns just floating around at the moment that I'm working on, but my next pattern is going to be a full size backpack. So that's going to take a while to work out because we're wanting to do like a few additional options for like an optional laptop sleeve that goes inside and bottle holders and all that sort of stuff. So it's going to take me a while. So if you don't see me for a little while, that's why. But I'm pretty sure now that my husband Adam is involved in the business a bit more, that he's going to be getting me to do some other tutorials in the meantime. He wants me to do a tutorial for my old IDEXA pouch, which would be a free tutorial. He's also got some little leather trays that he wants to bring out as a little tutorial. So keep an eye on the channel. There's going to be other stuff coming out soon. But I really hope that you're going to give this little one a try, the Konin. And if you do, please do tag me on social media. I love to see what you guys make. Make sure that you tag me on Instagram or Facebook or Pinterest and use the hashtag Konin Bowler Purse, then I can find it on there too. So I can't wait to see what you all make. Thanks so much for joining me.